My name is Nora, and I was 25 the night my parents handed my sister the keys to our family home and handed me a suitcase. Not a gift, not a check, a suitcase. My own old one, the gray one with the broken zipper pull, already packed and sitting by the door before I'd even come downstairs. My mother said, "Kayla has a family to think about now. Honey, you'll land on your feet. You always do." My father said, "We'd like you out by Sunday." And as I picked up that suitcase and walked toward the door of the only home I'd ever known, my grandmother caught my hand. She pressed something small and cold and metal into my palm, and she leaned in close, and she whispered 4 words. Lakeside Bank. Tuesday. Quiet. It was a little brass key. And what it opened didn't make me the owner of anything. It just told me the truth, and the truth was the one thing my parents had spent 22 years hoping I'd never go looking for. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. So let me take you back to that kitchen, because I need you to see it the way I saw it. It was a Thursday. My mother had made pot roast, which should have told me something, because she only made pot roast when she wanted everyone soft and full and agreeable. Kayla was there with her husband Derek and their 2-year-old Mason. And about halfway through dinner, my father set down his fork and said he and my mother had made some decisions about the future. They were going to sign the house over to Kayla. The house on Birchwood Lane. The house I grew up in. The house where I still had a bedroom, where I'd been living since I finished my associate's degree, working at the garden center and saving every dime I could. My father said it like he was reading a weather report. Kayla and Derek need the space. Mason needs a yard. It just makes sense. And then he looked at me and he said, "Which means we're going to need your room, kiddo. I was 25. I remember the sound of Derek's fork scraping his plate. I remember Kayla not looking at me, staring at the water glass like it held the secrets of the universe. I remember my mother already standing up to clear dishes, like the conversation was over, like my entire life had just been a single agenda item she could now cross off. And I remember my grandmother, Pearl, sitting at the end of the table, 81 years old, tiny in her good cardigan, saying nothing, watching everything. I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And my mother, from the sink, with her back to me, said the line I'll never forget. "You're young. You don't have anybody depending on you." That's a luxury, Nora. Use it. That's a luxury. Having nobody. Being nobody's priority. She said it like she was doing me a favor. But to understand why a single brass key could undo 20 years of being this family's afterthought, you need to know how I ended up holding that suitcase in the first place. And you need to know about the money nobody ever mentioned. The money that, it turned out, the entire family had been quietly standing on for 2 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the favoritism. Because it wasn't new. It wasn't some cruel decision made over pot roast. It was the water I'd been swimming in my whole life. Kayla was 4 years older, and from the day I was born, she was the one. The pretty one. The easy one. The one who looked like my mother's side of the family. I was the surprise. The oops they used to joke about at parties. Haha, isn't that funny? We thought we were done. And then Nora came along. When Kayla wanted to do competitive dance, they found the money to make it happen. When I wanted to do art, my mother said, "Let's be realistic, sweetheart. When Kayla went to college, they paid. All 4 years, room and board, the whole thing." When my turn came, my father sat me down and explained that money was different now, and that I'd appreciate it more if I earned it myself. So I went to community college at night and worked days, and I never said a word about the difference, because by then I'd learned that pointing it out only made me the ungrateful one. Money was different now. He said that to me when I was 18. I believed him. I had no idea. My teacher, Mrs. Boyd, stayed late and took a photo of me next to it so I'd have one. I still have that photo. It's the only picture of that night, and a teacher took it. That's the kind of thing I mean. Nobody was cruel. They just weren't there. Over and over for 25 years, they just weren't there. And they had a reasonable explanation every single time. I'm not telling you this for pity. I'm telling you because I want you to understand the shape of it. I had spent 25 years being told, in 1,000 small ways, that I was the one who could be skipped. The one who'd be fine. The one who didn't need anything because she'd never been given the chance to need. And the strange thing is, I believed it. I'd built my whole personality around being low maintenance. The good girl who never asked. The one you didn't have to worry about. So when they handed me that suitcase, the most horrifying part wasn't the shock. It was that some small broken part of me thought, well, of course it would end like this. Now my grandmother. Pearl was my father's mother. And the family had a whole story about Pearl that everyone agreed on. The story was that Pearl was a sweet, simple old woman, a little behind the times, lived in a one-bedroom senior apartment across town with her crossword puzzles and her church friends. Didn't understand money or modern things. Someone to be visited on holidays and managed gently the rest of the time. My father talked about her like she was a houseplant. Something you watered occasionally so it didn't die or embarrass you. What nobody in that family ever bothered to notice was that Pearl missed nothing. Pearl sat quietly at every dinner for 20 years, and she watched, and she remembered, and she understood a great deal more than anyone gave her credit for. I knew this because I was the one who actually spent time with her. Not out of strategy. I had no idea what was coming. I spent time with Pearl because I liked her. Because her little apartment was the one place in my life where nobody was disappointed in me. I'd go over on Sundays. I'd bring her the lemon cookies she liked from the bakery near the garden center. We'd do the crossword, and she'd tell me stories about my grandfather, Walt, who died when I was little a heart attack, fast, out in his garden in 2003. She'd tell me how much Walt had loved me. You were his little shadow, she said once. He used to say you were going to be the one who surprised everybody. I never knew what he meant by that. I do now. So that's the picture. A discarded daughter and an underestimated old woman, the two people that family had decided didn't really count, and one of us had been waiting 20 years for the other one to finally be ready to hear the truth. That Thursday night, though, I didn't know any of that. I just knew I had a suitcase in one hand and a mystery key in the other, and nowhere to sleep. I called my friend Steph from the car, sitting in my parents' driveway, and I cried so hard I could barely get the words out. Steph said, "Get over here right now." And she didn't ask a single question, and that's how I ended up on Steph's pull-out couch with a gray suitcase and a brass key and a life that had just been canceled. I want to sit in those next few days with you, because they were some of the worst of my life, and I think a lot of people know this exact feeling without ever saying it out loud. It's the feeling of being disposable. Not hated. Hated would almost be easier. Hated means you matter enough to have feelings about. This was something quieter and worse. This was being set down by the side of the road like a piece of furniture nobody had room for anymore. I lived out of that suitcase on Steph's couch. I'd open it every morning to get dressed for work, and every morning the sight of it punched me in the chest all over again. My whole life, the parts they'd let me keep, folded into one broken zippered bag. And then the math started. I had $1,100 in savings. I made about $16 an hour at the garden center. A one-bedroom apartment in our town ran $1,300 a month, plus a deposit, plus first and last. I ran the numbers on Steph's couch at 2 a.m. over and over, and they never worked. I'd spent my whole life being told I'd land on my feet. And now I was realizing that landing on your feet is just a nice phrase people use when they want to stop thinking about you. Nobody had ever actually checked whether the ground was there. It wasn't. Steph tried so hard. She'd come home from her shift and find me sitting in the dark on the pullout and flip the lights on and say, "Nope, up. We're getting tacos." One night, about a week in, I apologized to her for the couch, for the mess, for being a burden, and she got genuinely angry. "Don't you do that," she said. "Don't you turn into a guest in my house. That's their voice in your head, not mine." And I started crying. Because she was right. I'd been an apology my whole life. I'd been saying sorry for taking up space since before I could hear it. There was one woman I wanted to tell you about. A regular customer, an older man named Mr. Paren, who came in every week for his roses, asked me how I was doing just when I called, and I opened my mouth to say fine, the way I always did, and instead my throat closed up and my eyes filled, right there by the fertilizer. He didn't pry. He just patted my hand on the counter and said, "Whatever it is, kid, it gets lighter." Not good. Lighter? I thought about that all day. Lighter. Not good. I wasn't sure I believed him yet. 11 days after we came out, my mother finally called. Not to check on me, to ask if I'd cleaned up the rest of my boxes before they came out. So I went. And while I carried what was left of my childhood up to my car, my mother followed me from room to room, narrating, "We're thinking of redoing the kitchen for the new guys, for whoever. Your father has plans." She was so light, so pleased. At one point she actually said, "I hope someday you'll understand we did all this for the good of the family." I stood there holding a box of my own things in a house I was being erased from. And I said, "I'm sure I will, Mom." And I walked out and sat in the driveway and shook. I had no idea that afternoon that I was standing in a house I had paid for, that she was telling me it was for the good of the family while standing on the one piece of the family she'd decided didn't count. The phone calls started on day 2. Not from my parents. From Kayla. "Don't make this weird, Nora," she said. "Mom and Dad are stressed enough. You're an adult. This is just what families do. This is just what families do. Hand one daughter a house and the other a suitcase." I asked her, because I couldn't help it, did you know? When you came to dinner. Did you already know my room was being packed up? There was a pause. And in that pause, I had my answer. The whole dinner had been theater, and I'd been the only one who didn't have a script. "It's a 3-bedroom, Nora," she finally said. "Mason's going to need his own room eventually. You can't expect us to," and I hung up. The first selfish thing I'd done in years, and it felt like taking a single breath after being underwater. And underneath all of it, all weekend, was that key. I kept it in my pocket. I kept taking it out and looking at it. An old-fashioned brass key, the kind for a safe deposit box. On the little paper tag tied to it, in Pearl's shaky handwriting, were 3 numbers. 114, I called Pearl on Sunday, careful, because she'd said quiet. She picked up on the second ring, and before I could even say hello, she said, "Are you alone?" I said yes. She said, "Tuesday morning, you go to Lakeside Savings on 5th Street. You tell them you're there to access box 114. Your name's been on the card for 2 years. I put it there when I started getting a bad feeling about how they treat you. Bring your ID. And Nora, don't tell your father. Don't tell your sister. Promise me." I promised. I asked her what was in the box. And my grandmother said something that confused me at the time. "Not money, baby. I wish it was money." It's a question. It's a question I've been wondering for years, and I think it's finally time to answer it. I didn't sleep somewhere when I did it. I let myself go because of $1,000. That would have been the kindest thing I've ever done for many years. But she'd said nothing. Question. I had no idea I got home to Tuesday morning, drove to Lakeside Savings, hands sweating. The woman at the bank checked my ID, pulled a signature card, and sure enough, there was my name added 2 years earlier. They took me back into the vault, rows of little brass doors. The banker used her key, and I used mine, box 114, and she slid out a long metal drawer and left me alone with it in a tiny private room with a box of tissues somebody had thought to leave, which told you what usually happened in there. I lifted the lid. There was no money, no stacks of cash. There was a thin folder, soft at the corners from years of handling, and on the front. In Pearl's hand it said, "For Nora, when they finally show you who they are." Inside were 2 things. The first was a handwritten letter from Pearl, which I'll come back to. The second was a legal document I didn't understand. It was old, dated 2003, and across the top it said, "The Walter Hartley Trust for the benefit of Nora Hartley." A trust. In plain words, money or property that one person sets aside and legally locks up for someone else, managed by a person called a trustee, for someone called the beneficiary. The beneficiary is the one it all belongs to. The trustee is just supposed to mind it for them. The beneficiary on this document was me, Nora Hartley. The trust had been created by my grandfather Walt in 2003, the year he died, and it had been funded with $110,000. $110,000. Set aside for me by a grandfather I barely remembered when I was 3 years old. And the trustee, the person Walt had named to mind that money for me until I was old enough, was my father, Roger Hartley. I sat in that little room, and I read it 5 times, and the only thought in my head was, where is it? Where is $110,000? Because I had gone to community college at night. Because my father had told me, at 18, with a straight face, that money was different now, and I'd have to earn my own way. And that's when I picked up Pearl's letter, and that's where the floor really fell out. I'm going to give it to you the way she wrote it, because I have it memorized now. My Nora, Your grandfather loved you more than his own breath. When you were born, late and unexpected and perfect, he said God had given him one more chance to get something right. So he set aside money for you. Real money, your future, your education, a start in life, all of it, locked up safe, with your father as the keeper of it until you grew up. Then Walt died. And a few months later, your father's business collapsed, and the bank moved to take the house on Birchwood Lane. And I watched, from the edges, the way I always do, as your father quietly did the thing I have never been able to forgive. He used your money to save it. He emptied your trust, almost all of it. $95,000, and he paid off the house with it. Your house money. Walt's gift to you. He spent it on a roof for everyone but you. And then he raised you in that house and told you that you were lucky to have it. I couldn't prove what he'd done from the outside, and I was an old woman with no standing to fight my own son. But I kept this, the original trust. The one piece of paper that says, in black and white, that the money was yours. I've kept it for 20 years, waiting for the day they finally pushed you too far. If you're reading this, that day has come. I can't fix it for you, Nora. I'm too old and I was never the one it belonged to. But you can. You're the beneficiary. It was always yours. Go find out what they did with it. And don't you dare let anyone make you feel like the one who needs nothing. You, child, paid for all of it. You paid for all of it. I read that line and the whole shape of my life rearranged itself in front of me. The competitive dance, the 4 years of paid college for Kayla, the vineyard wedding, the house I'd just been thrown out of with a suitcase. I had always been told I was the one who took and gave nothing. The burden, the afterthought, would be fine. And it turned out I'd been the one quietly paying since I was 3 years old. Now here is the part that matters, and it's where this stops being a story about what was done to me and starts being a story about what I did. Pearl could not fix it. She told me that herself. She was 81. She'd never been the trustee or the beneficiary. She had no legal standing. That means no legal right to bring the claim. She wasn't a secret savior with a magic deed in a drawer. All she had was one old piece of paper and the faith that I'd finally be ready to use it. The rest was on me, and for one night, I didn't think I could. I sat on Steph's couch with that trust document, and I felt 19 kinds of small. Who was it? A garden scented caravan with $100, a broken suitcase, lying up against an iron fire, I didn't know a single word. I couldn't afford it. I almost could defend it by big hacks and let it go. The way I wanted it. But then I thought about my mother's voice and said, "You don't have anyone to depend on anymore. That's a luxury." And something in me went very still and very clear. I'd love to tell you it was easy. Those suits were fine. However little he paid me, he was still in there with a top of tie and a very tie. And there's a particular kind of grief in this having to take on to For about a day, I felt like the villain my mother always quietly implied I was the ungrateful one, the difficult one. And then I made myself say the true thing out loud. Alone, in Steph's bathroom mirror, he stole from a child. And the child was me, and wanting it back doesn't make me the bad one. I had to say it 3 times before I believed it. But I did finally believe it. I had spent my whole life being the one who didn't make a fuss. And being the one who didn't make a fuss had gotten me a suitcase by the door. So the next morning, I made a fuss. A quiet one, the right kind. I started where you start when you have no money and a real problem. I called legal aid. A tired but kind woman did an intake over the phone, and when I read her the trust document and explained what I suspected, her voice changed. She stopped sounding tired. She said, "Honey, this isn't a small thing. This might be a breach of fiduciary duty, and the dollar amount is too big for us. But I'm going to give you a name. Call Marcus Webb. Tell him I sent you. He does this, and he does free consultations. Breach of fiduciary duty." I wrote that down and looked it up that night. In plain words, when the person trusted to protect your money uses it for themselves instead. A trustee who spends the beneficiary's money on his own house has broken about the most serious promise the law recognizes. Marcus Webb turned out to be a careful, soft-spoken man in his 50s, with an office above a dry cleaner and a reputation, I later learned, for being very hard to rattle. I brought him the trust document and Pearl's letter, and he read them twice, slowly, and then he set them down and looked at me. "Miss Hartley," he said, "if this document is genuine, and if the money was used the way your grandmother describes, then I need to be honest with you about something. This is not a long shot. This is a strong case. The question isn't whether your father owed you this money. The question is how we prove where it went and how we make sure he can't hide what's left." I asked him if Pearl's letter was enough. "No," he said. "A letter is a place to start, not a place to finish. Your grandmother gave you the thread. Now we pull it. And Miss Hartley, we pull it quietly. The second your father knows you're looking, he starts moving things, telling stories, getting his own version out first. We don't tip him off. We build it first, in the dark, and we surface it all at once where he can't spin it. Can you be patient?" I'd been patient my whole life. The difference was that now, patience had a purpose. Marcus warned me, too, about what my father would say once it all came out. He won't admit he stole it, he told me. Nobody ever does. He'll say it was a loan. He'll say it was a family decision everyone agreed to. He'll say your grandmother manipulated you, or that you're being greedy and tearing the family apart over old history. He looked at me steadily. "And none of it will matter, Nora, because we won't be having an argument. We'll be showing a court 2 bank records with the same number on them. A liar can win an argument. A liar cannot win against arithmetic." I held on to that. 2 records. The same number. The same week. Arithmetic doesn't care whose feelings get hurt. There was the small matter of paying him, of course. I had $1,100. But Marcus, after he'd read the trust document twice, did something that told me everything about him. He said he'd take it on contingency. That's when a lawyer gets paid a percentage only if you win, so people without money can still get justice. "If I'm right about this," he said, "you'll be able to afford me. And if I'm wrong, you shouldn't have to pay for my mistake." It was the first time in my adult life a person in a position of power had bet on me instead of asking what I could do for them. I signed the papers right there. My hand was steady. I noticed that, for the first time in weeks, my hand was steady. So we built it. And I want to walk you through it, because every piece was mine to gather. And gathering it was the first time in my life I stopped feeling disposable. The first thing Marcus did was establish that the trust was real, and that I was the beneficiary. That's the easy part. It's right there on the document. Witnessed and notarized in 2003 by a lawyer who, it turned out, had since retired, but kept his records. Marcus tracked the old lawyer down, The man remembered Walt, remembered the trust, and confirmed it was legitimate and properly funded. A witness. A real one, who could say under oath that the money had existed. The second piece was the money trail, and this was the part I had to do myself, with Marcus telling me exactly where to look. As the beneficiary, I had a legal right to an accounting. That means the trustee, my father, can be legally forced to show every dollar that went in and out of the trust. But before we demanded that, we took to move. Marcus wanted independent proof. So we requested historical records of the Paren, the bank that had held the trust, the bank that had held the mortgage on Birchwood Lane in 2004. It took weeks. I made the calls. I signed the request forms. I sat on hold. I drove to 2 different branches with my ID and the trust document showing I had the right to pass. And it didn't go smoothly. The first bank told me the records were too old to retrieve, and I drove home certain the whole thing was done. Marcus just shook his head when I called him in tears. Old isn't old, he said. Banks keep these things longer than they wait. Ask again, in writing, and use the word subpoena so they know you're serious. I did. The records appeared. I learned something in those weeks that I carry with me now and can't find it. Is very often just no one important has made us look yet. For 25 years, I'd been the kind of person nobody had to look for. I was done being that person. There was a day I'll never forget, sitting at Marcus's desk, when the second set of records came in and he laid them next to the first. And slowly, the picture came together in black and white. In March of 2004, the Walter Hartley Trust for Nora Hartley was drained. $94,600, withdrawn over 2 transactions, signed by the trustee, Roger Hartley. And within the same week, the mortgage on 212 Birchwood Lane, which had been in foreclosure, was paid off. Lump sum, $94,600. The same amount. The same week. My money. Their house. I sat in Marcus's office and looked at those 2 records side by side, and I didn't cry. I'd done my crying on couches and kitchen floors. I just felt something I'd never really felt before in my whole life. Solid ground. For 25 years, I'd been handed a story about myself and told to be grateful for it. And here, finally, were 2 pieces of paper that didn't care about the story. They didn't care that I was the easy one, the low-maintenance one, the one who'd be fine. They just said, in the flat language of banks, that $110,000 had been mine, and that a man named Roger Hartley had taken $94,000 of it and bought a house. No spin. No reasonable explanation. Just the truth sitting in a manila folder, waiting 22 years for someone to put the 2 pages next to each other. This is it, Marcus said quietly. This is the whole case, right here. He took your trust, and he bought a house with it. And here's the part that's going to matter most, Nora. He leaned forward. When someone steals money that belongs to you and uses it to buy a specific piece of property, the law has an answer for that. It's called a constructive trust. In plain words, the court can treat that property as if it's partly yours because it was bought with your money. We're not just going to make him owe you a number on paper. We're going to put your name on that house. That was the moment I understood what Pearl had given me. Not a house, not a deed, just the truth. Now I want to slow it all the way down, because here is what my parents did. And the beautiful part is, they did it to themselves. We didn't have to push. Because while I was quietly gathering evidence, my family was moving fast in that direction. Derek, my brother-in-law, had a business opportunity. into a condo. Kayla and Derek would take the proceeds. Everybody comes out ahead. There was just the small matter of the house being bought 22 years earlier with stolen money that belonged to me. But they didn't know I knew. So they listed it. I drove past one evening, and there was a sign in the front yard. For sale, my childhood home, with a realtor's smiling face on a sign. I called Marcus, half in a panic. They're selling it. There's a sign. And Marcus did something I didn't expect. He sounded pleased. Good, he said. Let them. In fact, this is exactly what we want. Here's what we're going to do, Nora. Today, we file a lease pendens on that property. He explained it slowly, because it became the hinge the whole thing turned on. A lis pendens in plain words, a public legal notice recorded at the county that says there is a lawsuit pending over who really has a claim to this property. It's a flag on the title. Anyone who looks a bank, a buyer, a title company sees it. And it means ownership is disputed, buy at your own risk. The moment we record it, Marcus said, your parents can still list the house. They can still find a buyer. They can do everything right up to the closing table. But they will not be able to sell it clean. Because the day a title company runs the search, your claim is going to be sitting right there on the record. And then, Nora, your father is going to have to explain, in a room full of strangers, why there's a lawsuit on his house with his own daughter's name on it. I asked him if we should warn them, if that was fair. Marcus looked at me, not unkindly. Did they warn you, he said, before they packed your suitcase? We filed the lis pendens that week, quietly, and then we did the hardest thing of all. We waited. I want to tell you, that was the hardest patience of my life, watching strangers tour the house my money paid for. Seeing the little pending sticker go up across the for sale sign 3 weeks later, when they found a buyer, a nice young couple. The Hendersons, I later learned, who'd fallen in love with the yard my father always bragged about. There was one bad night where I almost ruined it. I'd had a glass of wine, and the for sale sign was in my head, and my thumb was hovering over Kayla's name in my phone. I'd typed out a whole message. You're selling a house that was bought with my stolen trust. Ask Dad. One tap. I'd have felt powerful for 10 seconds and handed them weeks to build a story. I sat there shaking with my thumb over send, and then I deleted it, word by word, and I called Marcus's after-hours line instead and just said, talk me out of it. And he did. The satisfaction of the text, he said, is never worth the price of the text. Let the closing do the talking. So I let the closing do the talking. Those weeks of waiting taught me the difference between the silence I'd lived in my whole life and the silence Marcus was teaching me. My old silence was the silence of someone who'd been trained to disappear, to not be a bother, to swallow it. This new silence was a choice. It had teeth. It was the silence of someone holding a winning hand and choosing exactly when to lay it down. Same quiet on the outside, completely different woman underneath. I think that's the part my family never understood about quiet people. They assume the quiet means there's nothing there. Sometimes the quiet is just patience that hasn't been spent yet. And here's the part I love most. I wasn't even in the room. I pieced this together afterward from Marcus, who'd been notified, and from the buyer's agent. And it all lines up. So let me give it to you the way it happened. A Friday morning, at the offices of Meridian Title, downtown. Everyone gathered around the long conference table. My father and mother on one side, beaming. Kayla and Derek beside them. Derek had already, I later learned, put a deposit down on his franchise. That's how sure he was. The Hendersons across the table with their agent. And at the head of the table, the closing officer. A closing officer's whole job is to make sure a sale is clean and legal before any money changes hands. They're neutral. They don't care about your family. They care about the documents. This one was a calm, precise woman named Renata Voss. She had the title commitment in front of her, the report from the title search. And as everyone settled in with their coffee, talking about how lovely the yard was, she opened the folder, and a small line appeared between her eyebrows. Before we begin, she said, I need to flag something for the record. There's a lis pendens recorded against this property, a pending legal claim. She looked up, filed by a Nora Hartley, regarding misappropriated trust funds used to acquire the property. That's absurd. That's our daughter. She's confused. She has no claim to me. I'm sorry. It's property. She can tell you this. No reputable buyer can use this property until their claim is resolved. She looked at the Hendersons. I would not advise proceeding today. And then, the room went very quiet. Derek went first. What claim? Roger, what is she talking about? You said this was his franchise, his deposit. The future he already spent himself calculating in real time at the conference table. The Hendersons' agent quietly started gathering their papers. You can't buy a house with a lawsuit nailed to it. There was nothing to close. The deal died right there, in front of everyone, in a room full of strangers where my father couldn't yell or charm or play the victim. And my father didn't say much at all, I'm told. He just pulled the title commitment toward him and read it with his own eyes, the way a man reads something he's certain is wrong. His finger went down the page. And then his hand, the hand that had pointed at me across a dinner table and said, "We'll be needing your room, kiddo," started to shake because he knew exactly what misappropriated trust funds meant. He'd known for 22 years. The reckoning didn't happen in that room, though. It happened 2 weeks later. In a mediation, a meeting where both sides and their lawyers sit down to try to settle before a judge has to. And this time, I was there. I made sure I was there. And I want to slow this down because I waited my whole life for it. We sat at another long table, my father and mother and their lawyer on one side, Marcus and me on the other. And Marcus laid it out, piece by piece, in that quiet voice that never rose once. He set down the trust document. Walter Hartley established this trust in 2003. $110,000. Beneficiary, Nora Hartley. Trustee, Roger Hartley. He set down the bank offer. In March 2004, the trustee withdrew $94,600. He set down the mortgage payoff. That same week, the foreclosure on 212 Birchwood Lane was cured. Same amount. To the dollar. He set down the retired lawyer's sworn statement confirming the trust was real. He laid each one down slowly, deliberately, and slid each one across the table toward my father. And with every page, the room got quieter. My mother had come in ready to perform. I could see it. The wounded dignity she'd practiced. But you cannot perform over arithmetic. By the third document, she'd stopped looking at the papers and started looking at her own hands. Their lawyer leaned over and murmured something to my father, and my father shook his head once, slightly, the way a man does when he's just been told there's no door out of the room. And then he sat back and said, simply, "Your client spent his daughter's inheritance on his house and never paid it back. With 22 years of interest, the debt to Nora now exceeds the entire value of that house. We're seeking a constructive trust over the property. In plain terms, the house is hers. It was bought with her money, and she's owed more than it's worth. My father's lawyer didn't even argue the facts. There was nothing to argue. He just asked, quietly, for a path that keeps the family whole. And my father finally spoke. He looked at me, for the first time really looked at me, and he said, "Nora, we were going to lose everything. You were 3. I always meant to pay it back. I'd waited 25 years to be looked at like that. And when it finally came, I found I didn't need it the way I thought I would. You had 22 years to pay it back," I said. Calm, even. "You had 22 years, and instead you gave Kayla the house and gave me a suitcase. You didn't forget the money, Dad. You just decided I was the one person who'd never come looking." He didn't have an answer for that. There isn't one. The settlement was clean, in the end. The house could not be sold out from under my claim, and they could not afford to pay me back any other way. So the house on Birchwood Lane, the house bought with my grandfather's gift to me, the house I'd been thrown out of with a suitcase, was signed over to me, in full satisfaction of the debt. My parents took the small bit of equity that was left and moved to their condo. Derek lost his franchise deposit. I won't pretend I felt bad about that. I moved into the house that summer. It was strange at first, living in those rooms alone, every one of them holding a version of me that had been overlooked in it. But slowly it became mine. I painted my old bedroom the color I'd wanted at 16, the one my mother had called impractical. I planted a garden in the back. I do work at a garden center, after all. I see Pearl all the time. She comes for Sunday dinner, to the house her son tried to give away. We do the crossword. I bring the lemon cookies. She never once says I told you so. The closest she came was the first night I had her over, when she stood in the kitchen, looked around, and said softly, "Walt would be so proud of you. Not for the house. For going and getting it yourself. For going and getting it yourself." That's the part she keeps coming back to. Because she could have handed me a fight 20 years ago, and I'd have been too young and too small to win it. She waited until I was the one holding the pen. That was the gift, in the end. Not the paper in the box. The timing. She held the truth for 2 decades and gave it to me at the exact moment I was finally strong enough to carry it myself instead of being carried. My relationship with my parents and Kayla is mostly over. Kayla called me once, alone, months later. Not to apologize. Exactly, our family never taught us those words. But she said, quietly, "I saw the suitcase by the door before you came down that night, and I didn't say anything." It was the most honest thing she'd ever given me. I told her I appreciated it, and that I needed to know, and I meant both. And here is the quiet thing I carried out of all of it, the thing I'd give to you if you've sat with me listening. For 25 years, my family told me a story about myself, but I was the one who took up space and gave me food. The afterthought who didn't need anything because she'd never been given anything. And it was a lie. It was the exact opposite of the truth. I wasn't the one who took. I was the one that I'd never known. The dance lessons, the paid college, the wedding, the very roof over their heads it had been built, quietly, on what was taken from a 3-year-old who couldn't object. So here's what I want you to know. If there's a person or a family who keeps telling you that you're the one who needs too much, who's too much, who should be grateful for scraps, look closer at who's actually been carrying who. Because the people most eager to call you a burden are very often the ones standing on your shoulders and counting on you, never looking down. For the first time in my life, I looked down at the people who called me a burden, and I saw who had really been holding up whom. I looked down, and then I stood up. And it turned out I'd been the foundation of that house the whole time. I still have the suitcase, by the way. The gray one with the broken zipper pull. I could have thrown it out the day I moved in. Instead, I keep it on a shelf in the closet of my old bedroom, the room I painted the color my mother said was impractical. Not as a wound, as a reminder. Mister, Abernathy was right, it got lighter, not gone. The suitcase used to mean the night I was thrown away. Now it just means the night I finally went looking. Same object. Completely different story. I get to decide which one it is now. That, more than the house, is the thing I won. If this story reminded you of someone who was told they were a burden while quietly holding everyone up, or someone who finally stopped asking permission to take back what was theirs, share it with a person who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.